injuries to the face and orbits, a lot of it to the left side, as if a blow's coming in to the right.
While a few of the death injuries look like they were dealt by Spanish steel, the great majority point to a very different type of weapon.
And it's an object that's approximately 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter, and it takes out the left zygomatic arch, breaks the face, breaks the back of the skull, breaks the occipital bone, all in one piece. Whatever happened to this person was an extremely violent death.
And the shattered skulls hold yet another shocking surprise. A tiny bone beneath the ear indicates that some are women.
2 or 3 of them appear to be female. You can tell by the small mastoid processes, and they've got signs of injury too.
Is this evidence that women fought alongside Mochito and his men? If so, like many of the Puruchuco finds, it would be unprecedented. To look for the weapons that could have caused these blunt force skull injuries, Al and Tim head for the Gold Museum of Lima. It has the largest collection of historic weapons in Peru, both Spanish and Inca. The steel weapons of the Spanish would produce either sharp, piercing injuries or crushing injuries with clean edges. They would not create the sort of blunt force traumas Al and Tim have been examining.
It's not square.
What sort of weapon could have created those? Tim and Al go on to look at the Inca weapons.
Tim, look at this thing.
Yeah.
It's really heavy. Can you imagine what would happen if that got swung at somebody?
Yeah, isn't that about the same kind of configuration as some of the facial and the head injuries you were looking at?
Sure, it's just about the right size, and certainly if that...
So that would punch the skull in more than just a flat kind of fracture?
Absolutely.
Right.
It would fracture all of the fine bones of the face.
Well, that might be why a lot of the skulls you weren't finding the small bones, because they're probably so busted up that they disarticulated, right?
Absolutely. Well, that's an incredibly lethal weapon.
The possibility that the Indians found in the Puruchuco cemetery were killed by stone clubs points to a stunning conclusion. Most were killed not by the Spanish, but by other Indians. Of 70 individuals in the Puruchuco cemetery, only 3 show clear signs of being killed by Spanish weapons. This directly challenges the account in the chronicles. So what really happened at the siege of Lima? Willie knows that to get to the bottom of this mystery, he needs the collaboration of other disciplines. Not just forensic scientists, but historians too.
For 500 years, we've been told a handful of Spaniards and their irons and their horses were able to take an entire empire. Since we historians have gone beyond the chroniclers in the last 3 decades, this official version can be challenged.
Historian Efraín Treyes has been studying the historical records of the early Spanish colony in Peru. They are housed in places like this, the archive of the Franciscans at the convent of San Francisco de Lima. Efraín's attention was drawn to a long-forgotten court case which took place in Lima many years after the siege. It sheds dramatic new light on the events of August 1536.
Years after the rebellion, the heirs of Pizarro were arguing with the crown. And as part of that trial, they contended that the costs of defending Lima from the siege had had a heavy impact on the Pizarro estate, and they had to be rewarded for that.
The Crown disagreed. They brought Indians in who were present at the siege. The Indians testified that the fighting involved small skirmishes, but no major battle.
We have references of fighting during the siege, but mostly Indians against Indians.
Witnesses also claimed that the Inca army was in the thousands, not tens of thousands, that there was no heroic cavalry charge by Pizarro, and that Spaniards who did fight were protected by large numbers of Indians who were fighting alongside them.
So this leads me to think and believe that the Great Siege must have taken place in a very different manner than we have been told.
Willie's discovery that most of Mochito's warriors were killed by other Indians supports the version of events that emerged at the trial. It also provides the first scientific evidence for what historians have long suspected but could never prove: that the role of the Indian allies, consistently downplayed by the chronicles, was critical to the success of the conquest.
It's very clear when you look at the way the conquest went down that Pizarro's allies were very important to his ultimate victory. Not simply in the fighting line, but for logistical support, they were enormously important. It's very clear that their role in the conquest has been minimized.
No one has found more proof of the importance of Indian allies to the Spanish than Maria Rostorovsky. At 91, she is probably the most respected living historian of the Andes.
The Spanish were massively supported by their Indian allies. This fact, overlooked by the chronicles, completely changes our vision of the conquest. Without it, the story is absurd.
Maria has discovered documents that reveal the true story of the Siege of Lima. Found in the archives of the Indies in Seville, Spain, they show that Pizarro's survival at Lima depended not on military prowess, but on an alliance with a powerful chieftain in the mountain province of Huaylas. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru, he was a single man of 54. Eager to create an alliance with him, the nobility of Huaylas offered him a young girl as wife.
She was called Quispecisa, and she became Pizarro's concubine after baptism. It's a curious fact that the Spanish had all the relations they wanted with Andean women, but only after they were baptized.
Pizarro's young concubine, Quispecisa, is with him in Lima when the Indian armies lay siege to the city in August 1536. She is at the center of what really happens at the Siege of Lima. As the small Inca army approaches Lima, Pizarro does indeed send out a cavalry charge to fend it off. They follow the Inca warriors into a dry riverbed outside the city, where the Spanish horses start to break their ankles on the huge stones. Having achieved nothing, the cavalry retreats. Soon after, the Inca army once again advances on the city.
And the Inca army was actually entering the streets of Lima when suddenly they retreated. And the Spanish said, "How stupid. They walk away when they are on our doorstep." What had happened? I found in the archive of the Indies a document saying that Pizarro's young concubine sent runners with messages to her mother in Huaylas asking for help. She asked for an army, and her mother sent her one.
Quispe Sisa's mother was a chief in her own right. As soon as she received news that her daughter was surrounded in Lima, she dispatched a large army to relieve the city. Lima was saved not by conquistador heroics, but by the arrival of the army sent by the mother of Pizarro's young concubine. As the Indians from Huaylas descend on Lima, the Inca army sees that its situation is suddenly hopeless. The balance has tipped in favor of the Spanish. The Inca army retreats in disarray. They are pursued by a few Spaniards, accompanied and protected by large groups of warriors from Huaylas. The fighting of the siege of Lima takes place in small skirmishes around the city. It was probably in one such skirmish that Mochito and his people met their deaths at the hands of the Spaniards and their Indian allies. Now, finally, we can tell the story of that last day of their lives. We don't know Mochito's real name, but from the way he was buried, we know he was a leader, and he was young.
These clavicles, they aren't fused yet, so that's going to be put him around somewhere in the range of 20s, in the early 20s, late teens, maybe 18 to 22.
Typically, he would have had at least one wife and children. He may have known nothing of the upcoming battle until Inca emissaries came to Puruchuco demanding his support for their fight against the Spanish. On the morning of the attack, he would have set out from Puruchuco to cover the 5 miles to the new Spanish settlement at Lima. He and his fellow warriors would have been armed with the traditional Inca weapons, stone clubs, bolas, and spears. They were accompanied by their women, not as warriors, but probably as carriers of food and water for the day's fighting.
Don't forget that the viruses might have already arrived and decimated the indigenous population. Since they had lost so many warriors, it was probably women who carried the supplies.
Mochito and his people were part of the Inca army that tried to enter Lima and was forced to retreat by the arrival of the army from Huaylas. One likely scenario is that as they tried to make it back to Puruchuco, they were hunted down by a small band of Spaniards with their many Indian allies. Mochito's people were clearly outnumbered. Their deaths came with savage brutality.
So this is another individual who has a series of blunt force injuries, perimortem injuries to the left side of the cranium.
One warrior was killed like no other, shot in the head by a Spanish arquebus. The first recorded gunshot victim in the New World.
It is very clear that everything we've evaluated is consistent with indeed this being a gunshot wound.
No one was spared the slaughter, not even the women.
This is a young woman, and she's been hit very hard.
as a